But first, Dr. Richard Wolff is back with us, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, the author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, democracyatwork.info, and rdwolff with two Fs.com. His Twitter handle is Prof Wolff, P-R-O-F, as in Professor Wolff, W-O-L-F-F, as in Wolff. And Dr. Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I don't recall if it was last week or the week before, we were talking about, what is the Fed? Where did it come from? What job does it do? Why should we care? How does it affect me? We are now seeing with the nomination of Herman Cain, or the announcement of the nomination of Herman Cain and Stephen Moore, and now the withdrawal of Herman Cain, and Trump looking around for apparently somebody even crazier than that. And Stephen Moore, I guess yesterday said, well, if I become a political problem for the president, I'll withdraw my name. Who knows where this is going to go. But it's clear that Trump is hell-bent on politicizing the Fed. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. I believe it's a true story that back in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson, in the late 60s, when Lyndon Johnson was president, he brought Mr. Miller, who was then the chair of the Fed, into the Oval Office and literally walked him up to the wall, grabbed him by the tie, lifted him up on his tippy toes, slammed his head against the wall, and said, "You will lower interest rates." And Mr. Miller, Fed Chair Miller, said, "No, I won't." And he didn't. And, LBJ hated him for it, but he couldn't do anything about it. I mean, has there ever been a time, first of all, is that story true? And whether it is or it isn't, has there ever been a time in our past, in this nation's history, when the Fed chair, or when the banking system more broadly, since the Fed's only been around since 1913, has been as politicized as Donald Trump is doing right now?
Well, I don't know if that story is true. I don't know if you'll ever be able to nail that down one way or the other. I can tell you, in answer to your second question, that the sitting president always has an interest in manipulating the money system of the country because it shapes how successful the economy is, and that in turn will shape how people look at any given president. So it was precisely because politicians, among other things, intervened to manipulate the monetary system, not for the long-term benefit of the economy, but for the short-term election that they were facing a year or two later, that the Federal Reserve was created, as most central banks have been. It is too dangerous in a capitalist economy to leave the monetary system completely in the hands of capitalist banks. That's the ironic discovery of 200 years of capitalism. So everywhere you try to give the monetary authorities, the people who control the quantity of money in circulation, the people who set interest rates, you try to put them at an arm's length remove from the political system, not because of some abstract notion of appropriate economics, but out of a sense of the danger of not doing that. And the reason is precisely that, for example, to use Mr. Trump, he needs to win re-election in 2020. He wants a booming economy. So he wants low interest rates so that there's lots of money flowing into the economy. Everybody can borrow at low interest rates. That this, in the long run, is extremely dangerous to the economy is a matter of absolutely no concern, because for him, if he can't get reelected, he's out of the game anyway. That's precisely the problem. Now, in the past, presidents have known that they're supposed to, at least on the surface, observe the independence of the Fed, not to do the kind of thing that you just related in the story of Lyndon Johnson, right, or the kind of thing that Mr. Trump is doing. But since Mr. Trump's career has been going further in the direction of what the most right-wing Republicans in the past have proceeded to do, and to outdo them, well, he's now doing it again by literally playing a game as if the ups and downs of the economy, whenever they're not to his liking, are the fault of the Fed. And whenever the economy is doing well, he pats himself on the back and says it's his doing. It's childish, it's silly, but it's the way the game is going to be played under Mr. Trump's rules.
Do you think that it's, and by the way, that Lyndon Johnson story I've read in multiple sources, do you think that it's possible that, or probable, or the fact, whatever, that when Donald Trump went on a public rampage against the current Fed chair, Mr. Wheeler, that is his
Powell,
name, right?
yeah.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Powell.
Oh, that's
yeah.
right, Jay Powell. Thank you very much. When he went on a public rampage against him, that Powell immediately backed down and started lowering interest rates and changing his tune and all that. Is it possible that was influenced not so much by the state of the economy as it was by political pressure from Trump? And if so, what does that tell us for the future? And let me put this in a larger frame, if I could. President Erdogan of Turkey, apparently a year or so ago, when he was up for re-election, leaned very, very heavily, or earlier this year perhaps, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but I remember reading this in the Financial Times, leaned very heavily on his Fed chair and basically, flooded the market with lira or loose credit. And, trying to goose his economy. One of the outcomes of that was the beginning of some rather consequential inflation. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. Is that not the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid?
Absolutely, and the story about Turkey is exactly correct. That is what he did. That is precisely what he's not supposed to do. In the short run, even though he was defeated in the two major cities of Turkey, Ankara and Istanbul, very important defeats, he was nonetheless able to win the election on the national level, which again is all he cared about. The long-term damage, which is severe, to the confidence of the world in doing business with Turkey is simply not the way local short-term politics works. On the case of the United States, here's what happened. Absolutely, Mr. Trump's interference and the threats against Mr. Powell and blaming of Mr. Powell no doubt had an effect. But there was a deeper cause operating at the same time. The American economy was turning down. The last 4 months of 2018 were an extreme slowdown of the American economy, one, by the way, that is continuing. The only thing that has really turned up so far is the stock market. Why? Because they stopped raising interest rates. But that was done not only because Mr. Trump wants to win re-election, but because the Federal Reserve got frightened that the downturn of the economy could spin out of control. Then you add the mountain of extra money that the Fed itself has pumped in since 2008, and you have a very dangerous cocktail being mixed here. They got frightened, and between that and the Trump pressure, they stopped raising interest rates and are now actually talking about lowering them. The long-term danger there is an out-of-control inflation waiting to happen. We hope it doesn't, but it could. The prudent step would be to take steps now to stop it, but that prudent step is blocked by the combination of pressure from Trump and a weak underlying economy, and that's a real serious conundrum for us.
I was reading an investment newsletter this morning that was suggesting that it's by Aiden Forecast, one of our sponsors, or in the past, one of our sponsors, and suggesting that because the Fed has gone down in interest rates, and because this is now spreading worldwide, basically all these economies that have adopted neoliberal economic policies, from Japan to the European Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank, the U.S. Central Bank, he identified 3 or 4 others. I don't remember what they were right off the top of my head. I believe the British Central Bank. They are all now talking about lowering interest rates. And his takeaway was, therefore, now is a great time to buy into the stock market because there's at least a year and a half or 2 years. All of these countries have major elections coming up within the next 24 months. There's going to be another couple of years where they're just going to continuously be goosing the stock market because all these politicians want to get reelected. What do you think about that?
Absolutely correct. And it reminds me in this day and age of the famous remark made by the last of the great Louis that were kings of France before the French Revolution ended the French monarchy. He's famous for having said, sure, I'm goosing everything. Sure, I'm living high off the hog and all the rest. And then the famous line, après moi le déluge, which means in English, after me comes the disaster. That's what all of them are doing. It's a crazy political system erected by a capitalist economy that puts in place people with enormous power, our leading politicians, with very short-term objectives of staying in power, which leads them, not surprisingly, to make decisions that are good for them in the short run and are a disaster for those of us who have to live in the longer run, even them included. It's a dysfunctional political arrangement on top of an economy that is deeply unstable. And to imagine that this is not all going to come to a head in a very, very hurtful way is wishful thinking of the worst sort.